Hi, I'm Greg, W0GAS. I'm a CW operator. There's a couple other guys in here that I know, like Steve and Dan, operate CW. So anybody else big CW operator? I don't see many. Are you mostly interested in learning CW? Okay, well we'll get into that toward the end of this. So we're going to, you want to learn? Does stand for cool wave. Well, we're going to talk about three things today. What is it? Why would you use it? And then if you want to, how do you learn it? So it's shorthand in ham world for radio telegraphy. And that's not really too helpful to most people. So what is radio telegraphy? It's Morse code sent over the radio waves. So I thought I'd give you a little background on Morse code first, and then we'll move into how it's used with ham radio. So you may recall the story of Samuel Morse. He was a portrait painter, and he was working away from his hometown, painting someone's portrait for income. And someone that he was related to got deathly ill, so they sent him a message and said, hey, you need to come home as quickly as you can to help out. By the time he got home, this person had passed away. So Samuel decided that what he wanted to do was create a system that would allow you to transmit messages over a greater distance faster. And so he really created two things. The second thing is Morse code, and he did that with Alfred Vail. We'll talk about that in a minute. The first thing he actually got a patent on, and that is kind of a repeater system. So what he decided to do to be able to transmit these messages faster over wire was to use electricity. The problem with electricity over a wire is it dissipates with distance, as we all know. So what he did was he came up with a system that used relays to switch in new power every so often. And so we could go out towards the end of where the signal would reach and still control the relay, add more power, and repeat it and go further and further and further. This thing really took off. They went from a very few number of miles of wire to tens of thousands of miles of wire in a very, very short period of time. So what Morse was trying to do was create a way to communicate. And he thought that the way to do this was he'd have that electric current control a stylus and write on paper tape. And he had the tape was controlled by a clock, and it would pull it through, and then when the signal would peak, it would make a mark with a stylus on the piece of paper. And the idea was you'd then take this piece of paper and you'd go to a code book. And then you'd read in the code book what the message was. Well, you can see the problems with that. It just didn't really work the way he wanted it to. So he worked with a guy named Alfred Vail, who is really the inventor of Morse code. And Alfred Vail and Samuel Morse's code consisted of dots and dashes. Now it's a little more complicated than the code we use today. It was first used in 1844, and it's known as American Morse or Railroad Morse. Now, the mistake is often made, we think because we are Americans, we think, well, of course it's American Morse code that we use. We don't. And it differs from what we do use in that it had different elements. It had dots, dashes, and longer dashes, as well as different lengths of spaces. And the characters were kind of complicated and a little bit harder, I think, to copy, but they said it could be sent at higher speeds. And the American Morse, or Railroad Morse, was actually used up until the 1970s by the railroads in the United States. But because it was a little more complicated, it wasn't widely accepted around the world. So in the 1840s, after the original American Morse code was created, there were a couple of people in Europe, Gerke is one of them, and they created Continental Morse code. And it was a much cleaner system than what American Morse code used. And with limited variations, it was modified slightly, and we ended up with what is now known as International Morse code. So International Morse code came up with conventions. One of the first conventions is that all letters are made up of elements, and for a letter, you're going to have 1, 2, 3, or 4 elements. An element would be a dot or a dash, or a dit or a da, as we like to say. The numbers are all 5 characters in length, 5 elements. The punctuation ends up being 6 characters. So you had a very easy system in that you use dits and das, and I'll talk about the timing of these later, but a da is 3 times as long as a dit. And there are up to 4 of them to form a character, 5 for a number, and 6 for punctuation. This is an old chart that will give you kind of an example. If you look at the letter L under American Morse, you can see a real long dash. When you get to International Morse code, it's been modified and it's dotted it. It's a dot, a dash, and 2 dots. This is what we use in ham radio. So with that, we now were able to, using Morse's code, we were able to communicate over wires. And you've probably all seen the J38 up and down straight key, and it's got a little bar on it, and that allowed them to communicate across great distances, and it was helped, I think, a great deal with the railroad because it had rights of way. But for ham radio guys, we wanted to figure out how can we use this powerful technology to communicate over distances. And Marconi, using some information developed by Heinrich Hertz, figured out that you could create spark gap transmissions. And it's a little more involved than what I thought when I first got into it. I thought, well, the spark must be the way that they send the transmission. And it is. But as you can see from this diagram, they had these Leyden jars which stored a charge. And the spark gap was adjusted in distance so that it provided a path of low resistance. And then they had what amounts to a tuned circuit, which would determine the frequency over which this signal was sent. And so the spark, that gap was adjustable, and but it didn't create the frequency. The frequency was created by the circuit. And what they found was that you could, by using that spark to constantly have a low resistance path, you could like ring a bell. And you end up with these dampened curves, which are kind of interesting, kind of cool. And they happen really fast. But you can see the frequency of them and how it declines over time. The amplitude declines over time, frequency stays the same. And they ended up creating these huge interference patterns because it's like a square wave, and so all these harmonics were being sent out. And so this is a really messy, noisy way to transmit. So they found that if you reduce the dampening of these waves, they actually behaved better. So they ended up taking these waves and generating what would amount to a continuous frequency. So it's just a steady, it didn't dampen like the pictures I showed you before. And it was steady at the frequency. You could adjust the frequency by adjusting the tuned circuit. The way we do it in the modern radio is we turn the VFO and you adjust the frequency. So that is technically a continuous wave, or CW. But that doesn't allow you to send any information. So this, what we use, is really technically called interrupted continuous wave. And this is a depiction of what it is. Of course, when we're using millions of cycles a second, even a few milliseconds, you end up with a lot more waves than are shown here in this little diagram. And I don't know if you can read my little note here. I originally purloined this from the web, and then it turned out that it was in Stu's, one of Stu and Bob Whitty's books. So with thanks to them for ham radio school. But you can sort of see how this works. Another way to look at this is that what you're doing is you are modulating that fixed frequency with a square wave at a very slow frequency. The square wave being generated by the down, up, down of your straight key or a key. Well, what this does, if you think of it in that way, you're creating mixing products, and you end up with upper and lower sideband. And oddly enough, CW actually is transmitted either upper or lower sideband. Now, the sidebands are incredibly narrow. And part of that is due to the very slow frequency of the keying, whether you use a straight key or a keyer to turn it on and off. So if you look at that top graph, you can see a square wave being generated when you key down. And what you're doing is you're mixing that signal. And if you think of mixing it with that frequency, when there is no signal, there's no frequency either. You can also see in this red depiction that it's not exactly a square wave. And the reason why we don't want it to be a square wave is because with a square wave, you end up with all these odd harmonics. And so it splatters everywhere. So most of the modern rigs, I mean all the newer rigs, allow you to adjust the wave rise time and the wave fall time. And oddly enough, it may not make the most sense to just make that as long as possible. The shorter you make it, the more likely it is you'll end up with problems like the harmonics or key clicks, which is something we try and avoid in ham radio. So the advantage to using a continuous wave is that the energy is focused at a single frequency, and that enabled us to transmit over longer paths. So one of the things that I was asked to comment on today is CW the original digital mode? And technically, I think it is. It uses a simple on-off state. Now, it's not digital in the context that most hams use digital, because most hams use digital as requiring some kind of a computer to either encrypt or decrypt what was being sent. And also, if you think of digital as in a computer digital, it's really binary, base 2. It's either on or off, and the ons and offs are all the same lengths. It's either 1 or 0. Well, of course, Morse code doesn't work like that. So we don't use base 2. We have its and DAWs. They're of different lengths. We also have the gaps, and they're of different lengths. So that's the reason why we call it CW. It's really interrupted CW. It's continuous wave interrupted by the key. So does anybody wonders why we would use CW? Well, in the old days, it used to be required. It was one of the reasons why I didn't get a license in the old days. I didn't want to learn CW. It's simpler equipment to use, which is good. You don't need to worry about the voice modulation and demodulation. You don't have all the complexity. It's just a much simpler process. It is a universal language. Just yesterday, I was, as they say, reading the mail. I was listening on 10 meters, and I heard a guy ID, and then he said his name was Greg, and his call sign was I think it was US7IM, just from Ukraine. I worked him on 100 watts from my radio in Ukraine on 10 meters. So think of how much bandwidth is consumed by your signal. And I couldn't come up with a great diagram of that. This is a roofing filter, which kind of shows you that information. This CW mode roofing filter is set pretty wide for CW. But if you think of your single sideband as about 2,500 hertz or 2.5 kilohertz, think of your CW bandwidth as about 100, maybe 150 if you really send high speed. If you send at slower speeds, it's not quite that wide. So imagine you're using 100 watts of power to do sideband. That 100 watts is being spread out over 2,500 hertz. Whereas if you're doing CW and it's 100 hertz, it's much more concentrated. So there's some math, and you can go through the calculations, but to make a long story short, there's about a 13 decibel difference in using CW as opposed to using single sideband, and that's assuming you're transmitting at 25 words a minute CW, which is relatively fast for most CW operators. Most CW operators operate, in the 18 word a minute range. There are some people that operate a lot faster, and in contests they operate a lot faster. So how much is a 13 decibel difference? Well, it has the effect of being 2 full S units. That helps. It's also like using a 100-watt CW rig would be kind of comparable to using single sideband at 2 kilowatts. Think about that. So even though the sunspot cycle is really good right now, and you can really get out, with CW, you really have an advantage. And then you can also, if you operate CW QRP, say 5 watts, that's about the equivalent of running sideband at 100 watts. And so that's why when Steve gets up on a mountain and he calls CQ on his QRP rig, he talks to people literally all over the world. So it's also, CW is easier to decipher or to distinguish than language. And once again, I didn't find a great depiction of that. This looks like an AM signal where you have upper and lower sideband horizontally. And you can see that when you speak, only a few times do your peak signals get anywhere near your peak output. Most of the time it's much lower. Well, with CW, it's essentially either on or it's off. And so as you approach that noise floor, you're able to pick out CW signals much easier than you can distinguish what someone's saying verbally. Now there are some tricks that these sideband users do. You can do speech compression. You can, peak your signal. There are things you can do, but there's still a decided advantage for Morse code. So what do you want to, the first question you need to ask yourself, I think, is what are you trying to be able to do when you get involved with CW Morse code? You want to have a real slow speed conversation, be able to get on the air New Year's Eve for straight key night. Maybe you want to be able to do a little faster than that and work these Straight Key Century Club events. Straight Key Century Club is a wonderful organization for amateur radio and for the CW operators. They have all sorts of events. They have a program where you try and work, I forget how many people, maybe it's 100 people, and then you get a suffix you can add on to your number, your straight key century club number. And then the next level, you try and work, maybe 100 people that have that same suffix or a higher suffix, and on and on and on. And these people, they get on the air. They have monthly sprint-a-thons where it's not like a contest sprint, but it's an opportunity for people to do straight key century club events to get on the air and make contacts with other straight key people. Maybe you want to chase DX or operate contests. Now, to do that, you got to be a little bit faster because the DX stations, while they will work you, it's harder to get your call sign across if you're sending really slow. They want to hear it come buzzing by at 30 or 40 words a minute so that they can get back to you, work you, and move on to the next station. And I have listened to them work a station and then call before someone has finished sending their response call sign back because they're operating so slowly. Now, you can program the radio to send your call sign faster, and you probably could use a decoder, but if you want to work DX, you really want to be able to do CW. And contesting, that's a whole another topic. It's a great way to get on the air. You can really do a lot of different things. We're coming up, the first weekend in November is the ARRL Sweepstakes CW event. There are 84 ARRL sections in the United States and Canada. And in that one weekend, it's really about a 30-hour contest that you can only work 24 hours. You can work literally every single province and state in the United States of America. Now, the last 2 years, I've worked 82 of the 84, just intermittently. And last year, one of the states that I missed was Utah. I couldn't work them. I kept going over their head. But so it's good for contesting in DX. It's also great if you want to have QSOs at higher speeds. The higher speeds are nice because at slower speeds, it takes a long time to get even basic information across, and you can fall asleep before it happens. You might want to have real conversations at higher speeds, or you may really want to get into operating QRQ. In the United States, we don't do a lot of QRQ, which is high-speed telegraphy, but there's a real active group in Europe, Germany especially. Some of those guys can send and receive at staggering speeds. Yes? Well, QRQ is it's a Q code, meaning high speed. The other related concept is QRS, which means slow. So if you get on the air and you're working CW and the station's coming back at you too fast, you could send QRS and then send a speed where you're comfortable receiving. And in theory, they would slow down and send to you at that speed. As a matter of common courtesy, you are supposed to answer the person at the speed that they send to you. So if I get on the air and I'm calling CQ at 25 words a minute, somebody comes back to me at 12 words a minute, I slow down so that he can understand me or she. And that's just common courtesy. Now, contests, common courtesy is out the window. People are trying to make contacts. There are 10 weekly events in addition to the normal contest calendar that are contest practice events. 2 of them, the SST, the slow speed test, have a speed limit of 20 words per minute, which is relatively slow. There's an MST, which is 3 times on Monday, and it has a speed limit of 25 words a minute. And on Wednesday, there's something called the CWT, the CW test, and its there is no speed limit. It's kind of like being on the Autobahn. So get out of the way or get run over. But, you know, you work people, I mean, you will hear people in the 40, 42 word a minute range. If they send much faster than that, they have a hard time working people, having QSOs. Yes? You can. You can. You can. And I will tell you that there are the contesters, of course, they all want to go just really, really, really fast. What you have to think of when you think of CW is, to me, it's a little bit like sailing. You're out there because you enjoy the process, you enjoy the sound of the wind in the sails. You can go buy a motorboat and you can go really fast. Or you could maybe buy and build a racing sailboat, but you don't need that to have fun. So the big bulk of what I wanted to kind of get into today is, how do you learn CW? Well, the first thing is you have to know that CW is audio. And you get into trouble if you try to break it down into dots and dashes. We'll talk about that when I discuss learning how to copy. Copy is the way we refer to listening and being able to understand what was sent your way. Second thing that I think you need to know is transcription or head copy. And in the old days, people wrote down what they heard. And it was one of two ways. Sometimes they would just write down the dots and dashes. Other times they would write down the character as it came across. Well, there's a couple weaknesses in that. One is it takes time to write. Now, I have a friend, and he can hand copy 30 word a minute code accurately, 100% accuracy. But he's in the vast minority. Most people can't move the pencil that fast. And when you write down what you hear, you aren't thinking about what you're hearing. You're thinking about writing what you hear. So then, what did the guy just say to you? Well, I don't know. And you got to go back and read it. So it really creates a problem. So I would say you want to learn to head copy. Now, I'm going to go into a little bit of detail about timing and spacing. We'll talk briefly about paddles and keyers, straight key, cootie, bug, and then what other equipment, and then I'll get a little bit into the learning methods, because I think that there's been some evolution there over the past 15 years or so. So there's some do's and don'ts. First of all, don't translate what you hear into dits and dahs and then figure out what that means in dots and dashes and then figure out what letter that is because it's a lookup table. Because what you've done is you've taken audible to a dot and a dash to a lookup table to a letter. Take forever. Don't create visual mnemonics. Don't try and associate it with things that have the same rhythm, like God Save the Queen for da-da-da-da. Okay. Don't start copying codes at really slow speeds, figuring, well, you'll speed it up. Really, really a problem, I think. So what you want to do is listen to hear the character. And you want the elements, the dits and the dahs, set at relatively higher speeds. I would say never lower than 18, most times at 20. My beginner classes, we start them at 20, and after the first week, we bump them up to 25 words a minute character speed. Now, speed in Morse code has many meanings, and so you have to be kind of careful. So there is character speed, and that's the speed that you send a letter or number. There's Farnsworth speed, which adjusts the time between the characters or between words, adds some extra space. So I could have characters sent at 25 words a minute, but extra space added in so that it's being, the overall effect is 4 words a minute or 5. And so beginners I teach, we start them that way. 20, 25 words a minute, slowed down with Farnsworth spacing to 4 or 5 words a minute. And then as you progress, you want to learn the sounds of common words. But that's really not the end of it. So in terms of timing and spacing, there's some definitions. Elements are dits and das we talked about. A character is made up of elements. Character is like the letters of the alphabet, 26 of them, 10 numbers. And then we'll learn some punctuation. There's normally about 40 characters before you really want to get in the air. You want to be able to recognize those. Timing is the gap between the elements of a character, and spacing is the distance between the characters, the time between. So I'll give you a couple of examples of that in a minute. So dits, well sent, have a length of 1. Well, that doesn't say much, does it? Well, it's 1 because I don't know whether you're going to send it at 5 words a minute or 30 words a minute. But whatever speed you pick, that dit has a length of 1 and a daw has a length of 3. The timing between the elements in a letter or a number or whatever is the length of 1 dit. So you can see where this is getting complicated. And the spacing between characters is equal to 3 dits. Is everybody confused? Everybody following me with this? Is everybody going, why the heck do we care? And then the spacing between words is 7. Where this becomes important, the spacing and timing and all that kind of stuff, is if you decide you want to tackle learning this with a straight key, which I actively discourage until you get pretty good. Straight key, cootie or bug. Not only, when we get there, I'll show you why, but if you have to form the dit length and the daw length yourself, that's just one more complication in trying to learn how this works. If you use paddles, which I strongly recommend, it automatically sets the dit length and daw length based on what your keyer is set to. So how does this all work? If you had the word "and," it's made up of 2 letters, A and N. A is da, and N is dot-it. So if you are careful with that, you could send it as 2 separate letters. Da, dot-it. That's not the word "and," that's A and N. If I want to send it as the word "and," it's da, dot-it. And so you can see how that happens pretty fast. Now, if I wanted to send those same elements, a dit, 2 daws, and a dit, but I did leave the gap in between them, it would come out like this. Da, dot, it. Well, that's the letter P. It's not the letter A and the letter N. It's the letter P. Or if I send it da, dit, that's the word we, because W is da, and E is dit. So it makes a huge difference how you send them. So da, dit, da, dit, da, dit. Now, I recognize that seems pretty subtle at this stage of the program if you're just trying to learn how to do this. Believe me, with a little bit of practice, you will be able to pick out all the letters, all the numbers, and all of the punctuation marks. It sounds overwhelming. That's not the hard part. So we believe, at least I believe, that when you learn those letters, it's like riding a bicycle. Once you've learned that letter, it's burned into your subconscious. And you think, well, why, if it's burned into my subconscious, can I not listen to somebody sending at 25 or 30 words a minute, understand what the heck they're saying? And the problem is you got to pull that information out of your subconscious, where it's burned in, to your conscious, and then do something with it. And it's hard to do. And that's what we take and do practice. So these slides came out of World War II Morse code training for the Army. So this is a timing issue. It's all the same elements, but different timing. So low becomes enemy. Spacing issues, it's all the same characters, but they aren't spaced correctly. So instead of we got here, we go there. So it makes a difference. All right, there are two major schools of learning Morse code. Koch method, Farnsworth method. Now the Koch method, you start and you learn two characters at full speed with no Farnsworth spacing. They just come at you. Once you're able to do those, and they'll switch them up and change, the sequence into two of them in a row or whatever. Once you're good at that, then they'll throw another character in all at full speed. Then they'll throw another character in all at full speed. And it takes a while, but after a few weeks of doing that, you will have the whole alphabet and all the numbers all at full speed. There's a sequence in which they teach the letters too, but if you want to get into it, you can. Farnsworth method, I kind of already talked about. That's where it's the character speed, fast, but there's a gap so that your mind can pull out of your subconscious, oh, that was the letter A and that was the letter N, is the word and. And then one of my favorite quotes from Thomas Edison was, it's not the speed at which the letters sounded that perplexes the learner, it's the rapid succession in which they follow each other. Because what will happen is the letters will be coming across, and you might catch that first one, maybe you catch the second one, but if you're a little bit slow, you've missed the third and fourth one, and then pretty soon you're so far behind you just want to throw your hands in. Okay, so assuming anybody is still with me at this stage of the game, there are two parts to learning how to use Morse code as a radio image. One is you need to be able to understand what they're sending you, and the second one is you need to be able to send it to them. And so there are different levels and different stages that you go through in that process. So when it comes to copying, understanding what's being sent to you, we want to do head copy because it's so much faster than trying to write it down and then read what you wrote down and figure out what they sent you. So stress head copy. If you do that, it will be your friend. Now, that doesn't mean that you won't make notes. So when I work somebody, the first thing I do is write down the call sign so I know, so I can send it back to them, so that they know I'm talking to them. And I write down the guy's name, and then I'll write down other key information, like maybe their signal report, or maybe their QTH, or where they are. So the first thing you want to do is you want to learn the sound. This is a language that is learned from noise. So when I say da-da, or when you hear da-da, I want you to know that's the letter A. I don't want you to break it down into its constituent elements and then have a lookup table, because that just takes you way too long. Second thing you want to do is you want to be able to recognize those characters instantly. That takes a little bit of time, because you can recognize one, and then they send you another one a little while later, you recognize that. But if they send them rapid fire, it's really important that you can copy them instantly. So the next thing is as you're copying these characters, you need to start assembling them in your mind. And so you have a little buffer or a little kind of a chalkboard in your brain. It's like a little ticker tape. And so the person sends you like their name, Steve, S-T-E-V-E. You copy S, you copy the T, you copy the E. And you kind of form them there, and as they're running across, you're able to figure out what's being sent to you because you're that mental image of it going into the buffer and then moving forward. I'll tell you, one of the problems with this is most people's mental buffers is about 2 characters, maybe 3. And that's a problem. And yes, even at our age, and I work guys in their 90s, that you can build your mental buffer up by practicing, but it does take practice. But once you do that, you can then assemble those characters into words and then those words into sentences. Now, think about that process. So I'm hearing the letter A, I'm not going to go make a mental lookup table because we already know that's on the don't list. You put the A up in my memory bank, and I hear the letter N, I put that up there, and then I go back and I reread it. Well, that's kind of involved. That's a lot of steps. Now, your brain can handle that pretty fast, but it's a slow way to go. So one of the next steps is we want to get to instant word recognition, where you hear an entire word and you recognize it as, oh, I know that word. And that, for a long time, was sort of the end goal of CW copy, is you hear a word and you think, fine. Well, the problem with that is, of course, we have a gazillion words, and some of them are kind of long. And some of the long ones have commonality with some of the other words that are long and have the same first 6, 7, 8, 10 letters. So the next thing we want to go to is what we call phonic copy. And that's where, instead of hearing the characters and putting the characters into that little ticker tape chalkboard and then reading them as you go across, what you're doing is when you hear the character, you are hearing the sound that that character makes. So instead of the letter A, you're hearing ah. And it's similar to the difference between teaching a child how to communicate with you by spelling versus communicate with you by hearing what you said, the sound of what you said. And so the phonic copy is really, to me, something that you want to do. And it takes time. And I will tell you, as kind of a teaser, the way that the high-speed guys do this is they listen to code while their eyes are occupied doing something else, like watching a YouTube video with no sound on the video. And you're trying to copy the code while your eyes are busy. So I'll throw that out there as a possibility for you. Now, sending skills is a little different, because when you send Morse code, you have to know the dits and the dots. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. He was. It is. It is. Oh, yeah. The question was, is English the common language used in Morse code on ham radio? And the answer is yes. I have worked people literally all over the world they speak all kinds of languages. Just this past week, I worked a guy in Ukraine. I worked a guy in Australia. I work guys in Canada all the time that are French speakers. I work, all over Eastern and Western Europe, just literally all over the world. Africa. The words are English. So first step in sending is you have to be able to form each character. Yes, sir. Is there another question? Sorry, Steve. So let me repeat that for the benefit of everybody. So it is the common language, but there's other commonalities that make it easier to use it as the common language. We use common abbreviations, we use common Q codes. We talk about similar things through most of these QSOs, so that it's my name, where I am, what my signal report is, what the weather's like, what the temperature's like, whether it's cloudy or windy or whatever, what my rig is, what kind of an antenna I have. And all those have common ham radio Morse code abbreviations, which we'll talk about in a few. And so it makes it much easier. I can't say that I've had in-depth conversations with people in foreign language is their native tongue, other than that kind of universe more related to ham radio. Other questions, Dan? I don't know. I work a guy in Japan every week. Yeah. I mean, I work a guy in Japan literally every week, and his name is Ken, so I assume he's. Now, I've also worked people that have more Japanese-sounding names, but once again, the exchanges tend to be more structured. They tend to be signal report, first name, that kind of stuff. Other questions? Okay, so the first part of sending is you have to be able to form each character. And the way we do that, of course, is you read it off a page, you send it. So, of course, you're thinking in terms of dots and dashes. It's DAWs, left and right. We'll get into that later. The next step is that you need to be able to read text and send text. And so we will practice sending sentences. Some people will literally just send right out of a newspaper or magazine or right off their computer monitor. In ham radio, teaching Morse code, we also have these things called pangrams. And they are these fanciful, what I'd call a sentence. And the objective of the sentence is to use every letter in the alphabet. But the reason why you do that is because you have to send, and you have to keep switching the letters and getting them in the right sequence, and it's just a great way to do it. And there are literally hundreds of these pangrams. The quick brown fox jumped over the lazy dog's back is one of them. So after you're able to do that, reading it, that's only part of the process, because when you get on the air, you don't want to. The guy asks you a question, you don't want to stop and say, write it down and then send him back your answer. So what we also do is we then teach the student to hear a word and then send a word, or hear a phrase and send a phrase, or hear a sentence and send a sentence. And that gets you to the point where you don't have to think about what you're trying to send, you just have to remember what was told to you and then send it out. You've eliminated the visual aspect of this whole process. And then last but not least is you want to practice figuring out what it is you want to say, how you want to say it, meaning what words, how you're going to spell it, and then send it. And to do that at speed takes a little bit of practice. The primary tool for doing that is something that I call Dear Diary. And we just sit down and you make a diary entry. And so like I would just, with my key, I just start sending. Today is Saturday, October 7, 1953. I'm at Tech Fest for W0TLM, and I would just send that to myself. And because that's the way you have these conversations. You don't really know where they're going to go when you're interacting. Now we'll talk briefly about different forms of QSOs. But that's coming up. So one of the things that we need to talk about is what physical tools do we use? You already heard I'm a big paddle advocate. I think that's the easiest way to learn. I get people on the air 5 weeks in with 2 sessions a week. If you want to do a straight key, you can do it. I think it's a little slower. I think it's harder to do well, but it can be done. So here's a picture of a couple straight keys. The reason for 2 of them is one's the J38, classic up-down, great way to get glass arm, horrible for your wrist, avoid it at all costs. This other one's a torsion bar here, a key. It's a straight key, it's on and off, but instead of up and down, it's side to side, much better on your wrist, much better. It's harder than paddles because you have to form the length of the dits, the DAWs, and the spaces. If you use paddles, you only have to form the dit, the dit and the daw is formed automatically. You just have to pick it. Spaces you have to form yourself. It's harder to do fast. So if your goal is you want to participate in contests at 30 or 40 words a minute, straight key is going to be a challenge for you. If you want to participate in straight key Century Club events, it's the only way to go. You need to be on a straight key, which includes cooties and bugs. We'll talk about those next. But really watch the repetitive motion problems that a down, up, down, straight key can cause. Cootie or sideswiper, Dan's a big fan of this. What it does is it turns your straight key kind of on the side, but you can form the dits and the daws by moving the paddle to the left or right. So you've doubled the complexity in terms of forming how long the dit and the daw is, because you have to be able to form it both with your thumb, dit and a daw, or with your fingers, dit and a daw. So it's twice the complexity there. There is a limit on speed. You hear guys that are competent at this that can operate up to 30. I don't really hear people over 30. On the straight key, I really don't hear straight key guys over about 25. You know, you get them up in the 20s, but not really high speed. There are some people that can send really high speed with straight key. Don't get me wrong. Then there's this thing called the bug. And it has its own following. It's incredibly complicated. They're hard to set up. They're hard to operate. They're hard to copy. Every time you use them, you got to readjust them. But there is a devoted crowd that just loves these things because of all the headaches that you get. It also qualifies for Straight Key Century Club. The key takeaway is there's a weight on a pendulum, and you adjust the weight, and it forms the daws by vibrating back and forth when you hit the key. And so if you want to change speeds, you move where the weight is on this fulcrum. And so if someone comes back to you and you want to go back to them at a slower speed, you're SOL unless you want to stop everything and adjust your bugs so that you can do it. And then this is what I use for paddles. This isn't my paddle, but you get the idea. If you on your thumb side, it's a dit. On your finger side, it's a daw. If you touch it, the keyer says exactly what speed you're going to be sending at. If you hold it down, it will repeat that side. So if I hold the dit side down, it'll just send a string of dits. If you have a two paddle device, it'll do iambic. If you squeeze them together, it will alternate. Iambic pentameter is where that comes from. Iambic pentameter, the poetry device. And then that's if you start with the dit side. If you start with the daw side, there's another word for that. I don't know what it is. It does not qualify for Straight Key Century Club. You can operate much faster speeds and much cleaner code. The really high-speed guys tend to move away from iambic or two paddles to single paddles because it's easier to make a mistake when you have the two than it is when you have a single. Equipment for practicing, you're going to need some kind of a code oscillator. Most modern rigs will let you do it. Just plug in, turn your break-in off, turn your side tone up, and you'll be able to hear yourself practice. Besides the first 40 characters, which we talked about, 26 letters, 10 numbers, 4 items of punctuation, you need to learn your cue codes. You already know some of them because hams are hams. This is a list of the common cue codes that you will hear on the air in Morse code. The hardest part for me was trying to learn abbreviations because people will send you back something and it's hard enough to copy the characters, and pretty soon the characters don't mean what the characters are. So an example in this list is ES. That means the word and. Or instead of sending for, F-O-R, they'll send fer, F-E-R. Or, instead of, you can see them all. It's challenging. So this is a very short list. I worked with a guy last night. Every other word, he abbreviates anything. It doesn't even have to be on the standard abbreviation table. He just abbreviates. And he just, because he's sending the message across. Now, as I was telling somebody today, This guy had his first CW QSO in 1958. And he sends Morse code like nobody's business. And, you know, he slowed down and worked with me, and we had a nice conversation. There's another fun part of Morse code is there's things called cosigns, and there are 2 or 3 letter combinations sent as one letter, meaning there's no 3-bit gap between the 2 letters. It's only 1-bit gap. And this is a list of them, kind of a fun bit of trivia. SOS is sent as a prosign. There's no gaps. It's just okay. There's controversy among ham radio operators about using cut numbers. You will use 5NN virtually every day, where N means 9. I would discourage you from using any other cut numbers in your Morse code career unless someone is really expecting it. I do these weekly events on Wednesday called the CW test, and I work a guy whose number is UAND. Okay, so there's a basic format for QSOs. They go from simple to more complicated, but briefly, when you work a DX station, what they will do is they will call CQ, send their call sign, and they will typically send the word up. And they might have a number after it, they might not. And then when you respond, you send your call sign alone, and that's it, you can wait. And then when he comes back to you, he'll send you your call sign, and then whatever the correct exchange is, it's normally just 599. I would respond with 599, and then I always send Colorado CO so they know where they got it. SOTA and POTA, it's a similar kind of a deal, although in SOTA and POTA they can also send their peak number or their park number. You might actually drop into a little bit of chit-chat, but it, generally speaking, they tend to be fairly short, fairly scripted QSOs. Contesting, it's always very scripted, very short. Call CQ, send a call sign, you send your call sign, they come back with your call sign in the exchange, you hit thank you and their call sign, or their exchange, and that's the end of it. Now, conversational QSOs, they get more involved. It's more of your RST, 599 or 539 or whatever the correct one is, your name and your QTH. The next round you might say my rig and my antenna and my power. The one after that you might say the weather and the temperature and that kind of stuff. I personally don't like all that stuff. I never tell people what my rig is. I will tell them what the power is, and I will tell them what my antenna is, because they care, because that'll tell them how good the propagation is to them. But they don't care whether they have a Yaesu or an Icon, generally speaking. But to me, the fun part is to ask them about their family and about their hometown, what their other hobbies are, and what they did for a living, and that kind of stuff. So if you want to learn, there's some online tools. I'm going to kind of jump ahead here. Morse Code Ninja is a wonderful site. I would strongly recommend you go there. Morse Code Ninja has instructions on its website on how to set up to use it as a podcast. That'll enable you to use it with your phone wherever you are. He has literally 20,000 hours of material on his site. Anything you can imagine, he does. If you imagine he doesn't do it, send him an email, he will. Here's a list. Don't spend a lot of time worrying about it now. It'll be in the slide deck. It'll be up on the website. The second one down, Roofsy, will send you call signs. You can set it up so you can practice decoding call signs. Call signs are good because they tend to be random mixtures of characters with a number. So it's kind of a fun way to learn. If you get one right, it'll move your speed up 1 word a minute. You get it wrong, it'll go down. So it's kind of a good contest. But anyway, there's a whole bunch of different ways you can do that. Yes, there are classes, if you care. I am a member of CW Ops. We offer CW Academy. There are 3 2-month sessions each year. Each 2-month session is 8 weeks, 2 sessions per week. You're expected to study an hour a day in addition to coming to class. But we will get you all the way from not knowing any code to being on the air in 5 or 6 weeks. By the end of the 8-week session, you should be able to have conversations on the air quite easily. We use a Farnsworth approach. Classes are free. You don't have to be a member. The other big club is Long Island CW Club. You have to join. There's a small membership fee. They offer all kinds of stuff. It's a more complete club than CW Ops. They have all kinds of stuff. They have radio collectors and radio builders and all kinds of stuff. So it's a huge club. It's relatively new. It's really come a long way. Now, but they do offer classes on the CW Club. And they have a thing called the carousel, and you get on the carousel and you learn 3 letters, and then the next session you learn 3 more. And you can get in anytime you want, get out anytime you want. It's a lot less structured than CW Academy, so it might be more to your liking. In terms of CW clubs, these are the primary clubs. There are others. FOC, invitation only, pretty snobby, all really good operators. CW Ops, invitation only, not snobby, but you do have to be invited. LICW, open to all, just pay the fee. Straight Key Century Club, there is no fee, just go get your number. FIS, there is no fee, just get your number. And I'll close with that side. So, do I have any questions? Yes, Lauren. Well, it is hard, and the question is, he's an old ham that's been around for a while and could copy and send at 13 words a minute, and now he wants to get back in, and he's having a hard time picking the speed up because he learned the old-fashioned way. Sadly, the solution is to go back and learn the correct way, and it will go faster if you do that. If you really think that you can copy all the characters, I would not do CW Academy Level 1, the beginner's class. I would move right into the fundamentals class. In the fundamentals class, they will help you with your instant character recognition, all stressing head copy and no transcription copy. Other questions? Yes, sir. Yes, it's possible to use CW macros programmed into your radio. It's kind of hard to do that because you really, well, I think it'd actually be impossible, but I suppose it's theoretically possible. Keep in mind how the exchange works. You call CQ, he sends you a call sign. You got to send this call sign back. Well, it's not going to be programmed into your radio, so if you're reading it off your keyer and he sends back, his call sign, then you've got to figure out some way to get that into your radio so it can get out. And of course, with a key, it's easy. Now, there are keyboard sending programs that you can use. And so he sends you a call sign, you could type in his call sign, and then your keyboard and your computer would send it out. So I guess the answer is yes, but on SOTA and POTA, do you want to carry a computer and do all that stuff? No. I suppose you can operate FT8 too. So. Sure. Mm-hmm. Right, and I work a guy that he has some kind of a palsy, and he has a hard time sending. I recognize his call now, so I can respond to him. He uses a single lever paddle, which seems to be the best solution for that problem for him. But when I work contests, I would say over 95% of those people, it's all computer sent code. So. Yes, Jim. Not really. So Yacy radios send the upper sideband, ICOM radios send lower sideband. Yes, sir. Although you can switch. Well, I beg to differ, but what happens is it's a very narrow sideband, and the actual keying is sent in that sideband, either upper or lower. The difference it means for you, because they're so close together, is when you turn your dial clockwise, will it go up in frequency or down in frequency? And the pitch that you're hearing. What Lauren is referring to is that there's a side tone. Because if you had your radio 0 beat right at the transmitted frequency is the same frequency on your VFO, meaning those two signals are the same frequency, it would be at 0 hertz, and that is below your hearing ability. So we add in a side tone that is an adjustable frequency, and like at mine, I prefer mine at about 500 hertz. And what that does is it affects what I hear, but it doesn't change the frequency that my radio hears from the other side or that I transmit on. But it is upper and lower sideband. It's really narrow. It's like 100 hertz combined at 25 words a minute. The other way around. But they're mirror images of each other, so it doesn't really matter. It's unlike with upper and lower sideband on SSB, which is a much wider thing. Well, the real benefit to that is if you are working DX and you've got your very narrow skirts on, your passband is really narrow, meaning your roofing filter, and then you've narrowed down your digital filters as much as you can so you can still comprehend what's being sent, and there's still an offending station there. If you switch between upper and lower sideband, it'll reverse, and you might be able to hear the person by using your shift adjustment without the offending signal being in your passband. Anything else? All right, I went over. I apologize.
Thank you so much, Greg. Nice job.
Thank you. Oh, thank you.